what people say to me is the fact that what you've done through your life as far as playing and the commitment and passion to the music.
Imagine being one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, watching other musicians become famous while secretly thinking they don't deserve it. For over 50 years, Jimmy Page has kept his mouth shut about the guitarists who made his blood boil. But now, at 81 years old, the legendary Led Zeppelin guitarist has finally decided to speak his mind. And what he revealed will shock you. This isn't just about musical differences or friendly competition. This is about pure hatred, deep disappointment, and burning resentment that has been building up for decades. Jimmy Page didn't just dislike these 6 guitarists. He despised what they represented, how they played, and what they did to the music he considers sacred. Get ready to discover the dark side of one of rock's greatest legends. These are the 6 guitarists who made Jimmy Page want to throw his guitar down and walk away from music forever. Some of these names will surprise you, and his reasons might change how you think about rock music history. Let's start with the most shocking revelation of all. For decades, people have wondered about the tension between Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton, 2 of Britain's most famous guitarists. Now we finally know the truth, and it's uglier than anyone imagined. Jimmy Page has never had to say out loud that he can't stand Eric Clapton. Just hearing someone mention Clapton's name in an interview would make Page's face turn ice cold, and everyone in the room would immediately know to change the subject. This wasn't just professional rivalry. This was personal contempt that cut deep into Page's soul. Back in the 1960s, when both men were starting their careers, people would write, "Clapton is God," on walls and bathroom doors all over London. Eric Clapton was being worshipped like some kind of musical prophet. But Jimmy Page would just look at all this praise and shake his head in disgust. To him, Clapton wasn't a god or even a particularly good guitarist. He was just someone who knew a few blues tricks and kept repeating them over and over again. Page once said something that perfectly captured his feelings about Clapton. He looked at someone who was praising Clapton's playing and said coldly, "He's got 3 blues licks in his pocket, and he'll ride them until the day he dies." That wasn't meant as constructive criticism. It was a complete dismissal, like Clapton was just a broken record that the music world was too lazy to throw away. The hatred got even worse when Clapton did something that Page saw as a personal betrayal. There was a drummer named Jim Gordon who Page had planned to work with on a solo project. But Clapton quietly stole Gordon away and put him in his own band without even telling Page what he was doing. To Page, this wasn't just business. It was theft wrapped up in fake politeness. Page later said in an interview, "Eric built his whole career off the backs of other people. He's very good at showing up late and taking credit for what was already half finished." This was Page's way of saying that Clapton was a fraud who succeeded by stealing other people's work instead of creating his own. What made Page even angrier was that Clapton never fought back. He just stayed quiet whenever Page criticized him. But to Page, this silence wasn't noble or mature. It was the behavior of someone who knew he was guilty but didn't want to admit it. The more Clapton refused to defend himself, the more it proved to Page that everything he was saying was true. When Led Zeppelin became one of the biggest bands in the world, Page threw himself into creating complex, layered music that required incredible skill and creativity. Meanwhile, Clapton was writing simple ballads and struggling with drug problems. One was building musical masterpieces that would last forever. The other was basically apologizing through his guitar for giving up on being great. The final insult came when Clapton made a comment about Led Zeppelin's music, saying he preferred things that were more real. This was Clapton's way of saying that Led Zeppelin's music was fake and had no soul. Page didn't explode with anger when he heard this. He just waited for the right moment to respond. At a party in London, when someone carelessly mentioned Clapton's name, Page raised his glass and said with ice-cold calm, "I don't play background music for anyone." It was his way of saying that he would never be second best to someone like Eric Clapton, and everyone who heard it knew exactly what he meant. In 1983, there was a charity concert where the organizers wanted Page and Clapton to perform together on stage. Clapton agreed to do it. Page refused without any explanation. He wasn't interested in making peace or pretending to be friends. To this day, the 2 men have never performed together, never shaken hands, and never had a real conversation. Even when people organize events to honor Clapton's career, Page is always mysteriously absent. He doesn't send congratulatory messages or tribute videos. For Page, not showing up is his way of making a statement. It's like saying, I don't attend the funeral of something I never thought was alive in the first place. The second guitarist who drove Jimmy Page crazy was Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones. You might think that two British rock legends would naturally respect each other, but you'd be completely wrong. Between Page and Richards, there's been a Cold War lasting over 50 years. Page once said, some people play music to tell stories, while others just strum 3 chords and call it art. He didn't mention Richards by name, but everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. To Page, Richards represented everything that was wrong with rock music: sloppiness, laziness, and arrogance. Richards didn't hold back either. He told Rolling Stone magazine that Led Zeppelin, despite Page's flashy leadership, had no soul. It was just stylized noise made for the market. He also said that John Bonham, Led Zeppelin's drummer, sounded like an out-of-control 18-wheeler truck. The hatred between them reached a boiling point at Madison Square Garden in 1975. Page walked up to Richards with a glass of whiskey, trying to be polite and shake hands. But Richards just smirked and said loud enough for everyone to hear, I don't shake hands with a thief. The entire room went silent. Everyone stared at the two musicians, and from that moment on, Page knew that Richards had just questioned his entire career in front of some of the most important people in rock music. Page didn't say anything back, but Richards' insult burned into his memory forever. From that night on, whenever Richards had the chance, he would take shots at Led Zeppelin. He compared them to a fake band that was created just to fill a gap in the market. He called them hollow and empty, driven only by loud volume and special effects instead of real music. Page didn't stay quiet either. In a 1977 interview, he said that anyone could bang out a few random notes on a guitar and call it satisfaction, referring to the Stones' famous song. But real music, Page argued, required creativity and the courage to try something beyond mindless repetition. When asked specifically about the Rolling Stones, Page dismissed them as 3 chords, 1 riff, and an attitude. Richards responded by saying that Led Zeppelin might have been good at making noise, but they forgot how to write songs that actually moved people emotionally. He said, they can build rocket engines, but they forgot to write songs that make people cry. The two men have never performed on the same stage, even though they've been at the same events, had mutual friends, and shared backstage areas. When Led Zeppelin ended after John Bonham died, Richards only said, I guess they needed more than just a drummer to keep the music from falling apart. It sounded like sympathy, but it was really another insult to the band's legacy. The third guitarist on Page's hate list might surprise you. Yngwie Malmsteen, the Swedish speed demon who became famous in the 1980s. While Page was busy proving that Led Zeppelin was the eternal symbol of British rock, this young guitarist shot up like lightning with dizzying technique and classical music influences. Malmsteen didn't just claim to be good. He attacked Page's entire approach to music. He said, I don't care about blues scales. I don't want to bend one note and call it emotion. That's not guitar playing. That's just laziness. Even though he didn't say Page's name, everyone who loved blues-based rock music knew exactly who he meant. Page never responded publicly, but people who worked with him said he turned pale with rage when he heard Malmsteen's comments. It wasn't because some young guy had insulted his music. It was because Malmsteen had insulted everything Page believed in, feeling over flashiness, soul over speed. When someone asked Malmsteen about his musical influences, and Jimmy Page was mentioned among 10 guitarists he admired, Malmsteen replied bluntly, I respect Led Zeppelin, but as a guitarist, Page is too sloppy for me. I prefer Paganini over blues scales. It was a surgical strike designed to make Page look like an outdated relic from the past. At Abbey Road Studios, an engineer remembered Page raising an eyebrow when someone mentioned Malmsteen's name. Page muttered, if you play 3,000 notes and none of them mean anything, what's the point? It was his way of saying that technique without feeling is worthless. The most dramatic moment came in 1991 at a charity event in London. Both men showed up without knowing the other would be there. Malmsteen entered the backstage area wearing a velvet suit and sunglasses indoors. Page looked at him and whispered to someone nearby, oh great, Dracula plays guitar. Seconds later, Malmsteen turned around, smirked, and delivered a line that became legendary, at least Dracula practices. The room went dead silent. For the first time, people witnessed this silent war playing out in real time. Page clenched his jaw and walked away without saying another word. Years passed, and the two men stayed in completely separate universes. They never worked together, never shared a stage, never even spoke directly to each other. When people asked Page about today's speed-obsessed guitar players during Led Zeppelin's 2008 reunion promotion, he paused and then said, "Some people play very fast, but you can't play emotion at 200 beats per minute." There was a slight smile on his face, as if he was reaffirming the difference between speed and soul. The fourth name on Page's list is perhaps the most shocking of all, Jimi Hendrix. When Hendrix first stepped onto a London stage in 1967, the entire city seemed to freeze in amazement. Here was an American with wild hair, a flipped-over guitar, and a sound the world had never heard before. The crowd went crazy with excitement, but in a dark corner backstage, one man stood perfectly still with cold eyes. That man was Jimmy Page. They were never friends, and they weren't open enemies either, but between them was a sheet of ice that never melted. While Hendrix set stages on fire, Page was carefully building walls of sound like a master architect. And as Hendrix bent all the rules of guitar playing, Page was rewriting those rules with obsessive precision. London in those days was like a pressure cooker. Everyone wanted to know, who came first? Who played better? Who changed the world more? These weren't questions for newspapers to answer, but things that musicians felt deep in their bones when they looked at each other from across the room. An old friend once remembered Page saying during a late-night conversation, "This American comes over here and suddenly everyone forgets who was playing guitar before he arrived." The words were gentle, but every syllable carried a sharp edge of resentment. Jimmy Page never spoke much about Hendrix in public interviews, but the few things he did say painted a cold picture. In 1969, he said, "Some people think breaking guitars makes you a genius. Real musicians don't need fireworks." He didn't mention any names, but everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. For Page, music wasn't about putting on a show or lighting instruments on fire. It was about ritual, architecture, and total control over every sound. What Hendrix called feeling, Page saw as chaos. Where Hendrix played with wild freedom, Page saw only flash without substance. The tension began spilling over into rumors and whispered stories. A sound engineer recalled that during a session at Olympic Studios, when a piece of Hendrix's Voodoo Child came through the speakers, Page said only one sentence before standing up and leaving the room: "Distortion without direction." No anger, no shouting, just a quiet judgment that said everything. Hendrix was different in how he talked about other musicians. In interviews, he often mentioned Jimmy Page with calm respect. He even called Led Zeppelin very tight as a band. But no one ever knew if he sensed the cold distance coming from Page's side, or if he simply didn't care about what other people thought. Then in 1970, Jimi Hendrix died suddenly and tragically. As musicians and critics rushed to declare him the greatest guitarist of all time, the man who had rewritten the rules of rock music, Page stayed completely silent. No tribute article, no public statement, not even a simple message of condolence. When someone finally asked Page about Hendrix's legacy, he simply replied, "It was a unique moment in time." The sentence was so empty and cold that no one could tell if it was meant as praise or dismissal. When magazines started ranking Hendrix as the greatest guitarist who ever lived, Page quietly found himself listed in second place. For most people, that would be a tremendous honor. For Page, it might have been a cruel reminder that the world had chosen its guitar god, and it wasn't him. The envy, if it existed, didn't come from wondering who played better. It came from knowing who would be remembered, who became a legend before growing old, who stormed into history like a hurricane while the other continued carefully laying bricks on his musical cathedral. Perhaps what haunted Page wasn't Hendrix's sound, but how he made people forget all the other sounds that came before him. Jimmy Page may never have said, "I hate Jimi Hendrix" out loud, but every subtle criticism, every uncomfortable silence, every time he left the room when Hendrix's music played said it all. The fifth guitarist who drove Page to distraction was Eddie Van Halen. When Eddie exploded onto the rock scene in the late 1970s like lightning striking the earth, the world saw a revolution. But Jimmy Page saw a threat to everything he held sacred. The world praised Eddie as a genius who had redefined what the electric guitar could do. His finger-tapping technique, lightning-fast solos, and songs like Eruption made an entire generation of guitarists reconsider everything they thought they knew about their instrument. But to Jimmy Page, this wasn't evolution. It was betrayal. One night in 1978 at a London pub, a group of session musicians gathered with Page to listen to a new tape from California featuring this young Eddie Van Halen. As the first tapping section played, someone in the room said, "This kid's got something special." Page stayed silent, took a long drag from his cigarette, and slowly released a sentence that cut like a knife. "Anyone can learn parlor tricks. Real guitar playing comes from the heart, not from showing off like a circus performer." The quote spread through the music industry like wildfire, and it didn't take long to reach Eddie's ears. In a later interview, Eddie responded with typical humility, "Jimmy Page inspired me, man. I got into the crazy stuff because of guys like him." He smiled genuinely, without even a hint of anger or defensiveness. But that calm reaction seemed to make Page even more frustrated. Not because Eddie was disrespectful, but because he didn't understand the rules of the game. Page had grown up with the blues tradition. Every note he played was like a scar, a spell pulled from pain and years of suffering. He built sounds like ancient rituals, slow, haunting, and layered with deep meaning. Eddie, on the other hand, was like a kid playing with electricity for the pure joy of it. He was happy, daring, seemingly never making mistakes, but also never appearing wounded or damaged by life. "There's a difference between playing guitar and playing with a guitar," Page reportedly told a backstage interviewer in 1979. He didn't name Eddie specifically, but everyone in the industry knew exactly who he meant. It was Page's way of saying that Eddie was just fooling around while real musicians were creating art. The contempt reached a peak during a 1980 recording session in Los Angeles. A young sound technician innocently played a clip of "Eruption" to test the studio speakers. Page, who was in the middle of reviewing demo recordings, stood up, crushed his cigarette under his foot, and said flatly, "I've heard enough bedroom noodling for one lifetime." No one in the studio laughed. No one replied. And no one played that song again for the rest of the day. To Page, Eddie wasn't really an enemy in the traditional sense. Eddie represented something much more threatening, a future that Page couldn't accept. A future where music didn't require suffering, deep meaning, or mystical knowledge. All it needed was speed and showmanship. Page, who had carefully built the Led Zeppelin empire on emotion and mystery, could never forgive that approach to music. "Eddie's fast," Page once told a sound engineer at Abbey Road Studios. "But if you take away the effects, the speed, and the flash, what's left?" It was a question that didn't need an answer because Page had already made up his mind. What's remarkable is that Eddie never fought back against any of Page's criticism. He continued calling Page a master guitarist and kept citing Led Zeppelin as a major influence in interviews. But perhaps that humility only made Page feel even more displaced and irrelevant. Eddie didn't need to compete or argue. He simply moved past the old ways of doing things, and that was more threatening than any insult could have been. When Eddie Van Halen died in 2020, the entire music world mourned the loss of a true innovator. Jimmy Page posted a simple tribute on social media, just a short paragraph about Eddie's legacy and contributions to guitar playing. But those who had heard Page speak privately about Eddie over the years, who had seen him leave rooms when Van Halen songs came on, knew that the tribute didn't come from the heart. It was just the polite thing to do. Perhaps Page never truly hated Eddie as a person. He only hated what Eddie represented, a generation he couldn't control, couldn't understand, and no longer belonged to. Eddie had moved the guitar into the future, and Jimmy Page was left behind with his blues scales and mysterious rituals. The sixth and final guitarist on Page's hate list was Ritchie Blackmore from Deep Purple. In the blazing heat of the 1970s, when electric guitars were weapons and their players were knights of rock, these two names constantly avoided each other like matching magnets that push apart. Both Page and Blackmore were masters of their craft and architects of sound who had carved their names into music history. But between them, there was never respect or friendship. Only caution, contempt, and a feud that neither man dared to name directly. The problem started in the most innocent place possible, the recording studio. Both Page and Blackmore had worked as session musicians early in their careers, so they knew of each other and had actually met several times. According to a sound technician at Olympic Studios, from the first moment they looked at each other, not a single word was spoken. But the look Page gave Blackmore was like someone had walked into the room with a guitar that was completely out of tune. When Page first heard some of Blackmore's early recordings with Deep Purple, he allegedly told a colleague with ice-cold precision, "Blackmore thinks every song needs a sword fight." It was a harsh criticism not only of Ritchie's aggressive playing style, but also of his theatrical, battle-ready stage persona. To Page, who believed every sound should be precise and ritualistic, what Blackmore brought to music was nothing more than empty drama. The contempt only got deeper as Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple rose to fame at the same time. While Page immersed himself in intricate, complex compositions like Kashmir and Achilles' Last Stand, Blackmore went in the opposite direction, leaner, louder, and what Page once dismissively called Renaissance fair nonsense. In 1975, a German music magazine quoted Page as saying, "There are guitarists who serve the song, and there are guitarists who make the song serve them." He didn't mention any names, but everyone in the music business knew it was aimed directly at Ritchie, who routinely took over Deep Purple concerts with 10-minute guitar solos that seemed designed to test the audience's patience. The tension reached its breaking point during a backstage encounter in London in 1974. Blackmore arrived late to a sound check for a charity concert. Page was already there, tuning his guitar and preparing for rehearsal. The moment Ritchie walked into the room, Page stood up, turned to his assistant, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I don't have time for costume parties." That phrase became legendary in British rock circles. Costume party wasn't just a dig at Blackmore's medieval stage outfits and theatrical performances. It was a complete dismissal of his entire artistic identity. To Page, Ritchie wasn't a serious musician. He was a court jester dressed up in fake armor. Ritchie Blackmore seemed completely unfazed by Page's insults. In interviews, he repeatedly praised Page as a very clever recording technician. Some people believed he meant it as a genuine compliment. Others suspected that Ritchie was playing a psychological game where the less you react to criticism, the more it drives your opponent crazy. But Page didn't need direct insults to feed his resentment toward Blackmore. He remembered every word and every slight. A close friend once said, Jimmy believed Ritchie had no soul in his playing, just speed and drama. In Jimmy Page's world, lacking soul was the worst sin a musician could commit. The most striking moment in their long feud came in 1991 during a charity event in London. Both men were scheduled to appear, but neither knew the other would be there. Blackmore entered the backstage area wearing his typical velvet suit and dark sunglasses, even though they were indoors. Page took one look at him and said to someone nearby, "Oh great, Dracula plays a Stratocaster." Seconds later, Blackmore turned around with a smirk and delivered a line that would become part of rock legend, "At least Dracula practices." The room fell completely silent. For the first time, people were witnessing this decades-long silent war play out in real time. Page clenched his jaw tightly and walked away without saying another word. After that encounter, Blackmore continued throwing subtle insults in interviews. He stated plainly, "These so-called blues pioneers are outdated. They play what they know. I play what's possible." It was his way of saying that Page was stuck in the past while he was pushing guitar playing into the future. Page remained mostly silent, letting the traditional blues rock community respond for him. Guitarists like Brian May and Joe Satriani both described Blackmore as technically brilliant but emotionally cold and lacking in genuine feeling. Years passed, and the two men remained in separate musical universes. They never collaborated on any projects, never shared a stage, never exchanged words directly. But the feud continued to simmer like a guitar string stretched too tightly, silent but always ready to snap. When someone asked Page during Led Zeppelin's 2008 reunion promotion about today's technically obsessed guitar players, he paused thoughtfully and then said, "Some people are very fast and precise, but you can't play real emotion at 200 beats per minute." A faint smile followed his words, as if he was reaffirming his belief in the difference between technical skill and genuine soul. The anger and resentment never completely died away. Even though Blackmore once listed Page among the guitarists he respected, there was still a clear divide in his comments. "I like Page for the way he saw beyond just being a guitarist. He understood complete musical composition." But even with this praise, Blackmore never aligned himself with Page's blues-based philosophy of playing. Music editors, radio hosts, and guitar critics all noted that this wasn't merely a clash of different playing styles. It was a complete philosophical split between technique and soul, between cold fire and warm emotion. One fan perfectly captured the difference. If Page is the architect of sonic cathedrals, Blackmore is the man sprinting barefoot across razor wire. The divide wasn't just between two individual artists. It represented two completely different approaches to what guitar playing should be. One built lasting musical monuments. The other launched explosive fireworks. And they would never meet in the middle. So there you have it. These 6 names represent more than just musicians that Jimmy Page didn't like. They represent violations of everything he considered sacred about music and guitar playing. Eric Clapton's repetitive blues licks, Keith Richards' sloppy 3-chord attitude, Yngwie Malmsteen's soulless speed, Jimi Hendrix's chaotic showmanship, Eddie Van Halen's circus tricks, and Ritchie Blackmore's theatrical drama. To Page, each of these guitarists represented a different way to ruin what he believed music should be. For over 50 years, Page kept these opinions mostly to himself, letting his music do the talking instead of getting into public fights. But now that he's 81 years old and his place in rock history is secure, he's finally willing to speak his mind about the guitarists who drove him crazy. Whether you agree with Jimmy Page or think he was being too harsh, there's no denying that his standards for guitar playing were incredibly high. He demanded soul, precision, creativity, and respect for the blues tradition that created rock music in the first place. Anyone who didn't meet those standards earned his contempt, no matter how famous or successful they became. Which of these 6 names surprised you the most? Do you think Jimmy Page was right to criticize these guitarists, or was he being unfairly judgmental? Drop a comment below and tell us who you think is the greatest guitarist of all time, and whether there's anyone you think never should have picked up a guitar in the first place. Don't forget to hit that like button if this video opened your eyes to the darker side of rock history, share it with your friends who love guitar music, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the raw and electrifying world of rock and roll.